Back in 1843, right in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, a writer named Thomas Carlyle looked around at his country and saw something deeply, deeply wrong. A puzzle, really, and he laid it all out in his incredible book, Past and Present. So today, we're going to dive into his fiery critique of a society that was literally drowning in wealth, but was spiritually starving. You might be surprised how much it still resonates.
Everything really kicks off with this shocking paradox. Just think about that for a second. How can a country that has everything, that's overflowing with riches, be dying of starvation at its very core? This one sentence just perfectly captures the crisis Carlyle was seeing. A nation that had figured out how to make immense wealth, but had no idea how to take care of its own people. So, who was the guy asking these really uncomfortable questions? Well, Thomas Carlyle wasn't just some random writer. He was one of the most respected thinkers of his time, a real Victorian sage. And he wasn't impressed by all the new factories and the smoke pouring into the sky. Nope. He was way more concerned with what he called the condition of England question. Basically, what was the moral and spiritual health of a society that was obsessed with machines and money?
All right, so let's unpack the problem exactly as Carlyle saw it. And he wasn't just talking about, abstract economics. He was looking at the actual, brutal, human cost of all this so-called progress.
This number, it really tells a huge part of the story. While all these factories were churning out wealth like never before, an estimated 2 million people were just wasting away in workhouses. And Carlyle, he didn't mince words. He called these places poor law prisons, because that's what they were. Prisons where you were trapped, you weren't allowed to work, and you were just left to despair. To try and explain this massive disconnect, Carlyle came up with this brilliant metaphor. He said the nation's wealth was like enchanted fruit. It's everywhere you look, it's ripe, it's ready, but there's a curse on it. A curse that prevents the workers, the very people making it all happen, from ever actually tasting it. For the poor, that meant starving while surrounded by food, and for the rich, it meant a kind of deep spiritual emptiness.
And this whole paradox led to what Carlyle famously called the two nations, the idea that you had two different countries living on this same soil, side by side, but in completely separate worlds, with this huge, unbridgeable canyon between them. And this just illustrates that divide perfectly. On one side, you have the wealthy, living behind what he calls gold walls. But they're not really happy. They're suffering from a kind of moral paralysis, a spiritual emptiness. Then, on the other side, you have the poor, trapped in workhouse bastilles, a reference to the infamous French prison. Their ability to work, their very dignity has been crippled. It was a society where one group had all the means and the other had all the misery. Now, to show just how bad things were, how deeply this crisis had rotted away basic human values, Carlyle brings up this true, absolutely horrifying story from a town called Stockport, a mother and a father, so utterly desperate, so beyond hope, that they poisoned their own children just to collect a tiny amount of burial insurance money. For Carlyle, this wasn't just a crime, it was a symptom of a society that had completely lost its soul. Seeing this level of moral decay, well, it led Carlyle to write in a really unique way. He didn't sound like a detached scholar writing a report. He sounded like an Old Testament prophet, using this incredibly powerful style to sound a desperate, urgent alarm. At the very heart of the problem was a term Carlyle himself came up with, mammonism. That was his name for the new religion of England, the worship of money. He basically argued that this relentless chase for profit, above everything else, above people, above justice, above morality, was a poison that was corrupting the entire nation from the inside out. And his writing style totally reflected that urgency. It was dark, it was critical, it sounded like a sermon from a pulpit. He just broke all the literary rules, mashing together history, philosophy, and storytelling. You see, he had studied the French Revolution, and he saw all the same warning signs popping up in England. So he used his writing to basically scream from the rooftops that if things didn't change fast, a violent revolution was coming. Carlyle framed this whole social crisis as a life or death test. He called it the Sphinx riddle. Just like in the old Greek myth, the Sphinx asks you a riddle, and if you can't answer it, you get devoured. He said the starving workers were basically asking the rich, what are you going to do with us? And England had to come up with a real moral answer to that question, or the whole country was going to perish. But here's the thing. Carlyle wasn't just a critic pointing out all the problems. He actually offered a solution. And it wasn't about new laws or some fancy economic theory. No, For him, it was about a radical change in leadership and a whole new way of thinking about work itself. At the very core of his solution was this idea. Carlyle truly believed that meaningful work was sacred. It's how we find purpose, how we connect with the world around us. And he saw idleness, both the forced idleness of the poor in workhouses and the lazy, pointless idleness of the rich, as the ultimate source of despair. So who was going to lead this big change? He called for a new kind of hero, the captains of industry. He looked at the factory owners, the entrepreneurs, the guys getting rich off this new system, and he saw them not as greedy villains but as potential saviors. They could become the new aristocracy, like the noble knights and lords of the past, with a sacred duty to protect their people. And he gave these captains a very clear to-do list. First, reject mammonism. Stop making money your one and only god. Second, organize your workers fairly. Treat them not like disposable machine parts, but like a loyal army. Third, build real bonds of brotherhood, something deeper than just a simple cash-for-labor transaction. And finally, lead with real heroism and moral courage, like a knight, not with the greed of a pirate. So what do we do with all this? What should we take away from this warning that's almost 180 years old now? What exactly is the legacy of Carlyle's fierce, passionate critique? Well, I think Carlyle's warning really boils down to 4 timeless lessons. First, that progress for its own sake means absolutely nothing if it comes with devastating human costs. Second, that huge inequality isn't just an economic issue, it literally rips a nation in two. Third, when a society's only god is money, it will eventually lose its moral compass, its soul. And finally, that real leadership is about moral duty, not just ringing up profits. And so we end with the same question Carlyle left for his own time, a question that feels just as urgent, if not more so, for ours. In a world with more wealth and more technology than he could have ever possibly imagined, have we actually found a better answer to that riddle? How can a world so rich still leave so many people behind? Or are we still standing in front of that same Sphinx, trying to figure out the answer before it's too late?